What to do? This is the Brothers on Books podcast where we find great books that will give you real value and actionable steps and have fun in the process. Please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations or if you would like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. I'm Alex Allweil, and with me today, as always, is my brother Jack. And Jack, we have a special guest today. And joining us is Jacob Lund Fisker, the author of Early Retirement Extreme. Jacob, how are you?
Yeah, pretty good.
So I guess
that's a bad question to ask a Dane.
Fair enough.
I don't have the reflex yet.
I guess to start, Jack. So you chose this book in our book draft. Do you want to give us a brief intro of how you found this book?
Sure. Yeah. So like you said, the book draft is a procedure we do to pick out the books we'll read on and discuss for the show. And this was a book I had read about 3 years ago, and it really changed my views on things and the idea. What is the difference between price and value is really what I took from it the first time. And I remember listening to a Bigger Pockets Money podcast. In the very first episode, they were interviewing Mr. Money Mustache. And I had never heard Mr. Money Mustache speak, but in my mind, I had heard him spoken about like he was the father of the FIRE movement, and we'll get into that in a second. But he had mentioned Jacob's book, Early Retirement Extreme, as a book that inspired him. And then I was like, well, if the cult leader of the FIRE movement is mentioning Jacob's book, maybe I should go take a look at this. And I got a lot out of it the first time, and I took some different things the second time, and then I passed it along to you, Al.
Yeah. I guess we're just going around. Really, the first time I read it, the first thing I really remember was the difference between, I guess, a specialist and a generalist, and I think we'll probably talk about that in more detail in a bit. So that said, I guess you want to take off for our first question of how is ERE different from, I guess, really the FIRE movement? And
yeah, okay. Well, I mean, I think ERE now is often seen in the lens of the FIRE movement, but originally it was not like that. So now it's seen as an extreme version of FIRE. But in reality, it's more like a set of alternative lifestyle design principles that have the side effect of creating this financial independence and possibility of early retirement. But that was not really the primary goal from the set out. So early retirement extreme is kind of like a clickbaity thing. I figured that I could lead with that and then get people on board with the other stuff. So the primary goal is more economical resilience and resource efficiency. So fundamentally, if you read it, and it's not an easy read. I mean, it's a strategist, a systems perspective on what I would call personal economics instead of personal finance. And so not only does it include finance or personal financial skills, it also includes technical skills, social relations, morality, value set, psychological understanding, and so on. And the book describes the importance of learning these things and integrating them into a system using systems thinking, essentially, in a way that's both efficient and quite flexible in all the things you can do. So in a way, it's a counter-reaction to the thing that the educational system essentially got convinced in the 1990s that we should all forget about all those, adulting skills that people used to teach, like carpentry, cooking, machine shop and all that kind, and just focus on being able to sit, behind a computer screen and be as, good programmers so we can maximize our income and then sit behind a screen for 30 years doing this like one hacking job and buying stuff to make us happy, and then we retire. And I think the FIRE movement essentially has remained in that mindset, not to be too judgmental, and turned it into a faster version of that. So instead of working for 30 years, you now work for 15 years or something like that. So essentially, as it's getting more popular, I mean, it's hard to control when people just kind of keep piling on in. You get kind of like an eternal September quality to it. So what we have is an optimized Plato's cave instead of the original mission, which was to leave this world of consumerism. So ERE is essentially an alternative to that, and the book is about developing the tools and strategies to create a different lifestyle that's hopefully also, at least to some people, more interesting than the standard 9 to 5 for 30 years or 15 years as a specialist. So yeah.
So you briefly mentioned the Plato's cave, and that kind of was how you started the book, and I thought that was a good way to think about, like, as a backdrop of the story. You want to describe that a little?
Yeah, actually, I have Plato's cave as like a little literal backdrop right here.
Wow.
Yeah, I got my wife was gracious enough to offer to paint it for me. So like I found some pictures on the internet and she made her own version. I don't know if I can probably bring it down. It's a lot easier to show than to explain. So it's an ancient allegory that's like super rich in terms of all the things you can cover with it. So I did not take like full advantage of it. So
oh wow,
cool.
Yeah. Very cool.
Let's see if I can hold it up here. Like, so Plato's cave is essentially this cave here, and the idea is that you have a bunch of prisoners who have spent all their life sitting here, looking at the wall, and they're chained down to the floor, and their heads are like chained so they can only look forward. They've never seen their chains, they've never seen each other, but they can see the wall here. And so that behind them is the fire, and the fire is supposed to be like the economic paradigm or the political like orientation of the community or whatever. And in between you have artists or teachers or parent systems that hold up these signs and project shadows on the wall. And these guys sit here and learn all these shadows. And get really good at optimizing. So in our version here, it has like dollars and euro and pounds. She didn't know the pound sign. I'm sorry about that. That's the wrong pound sign. Anyway, but then at some point, one of the prisoners that's supposed to be like the philosopher guy, he figures out how to like get rid of the chains, and then he looks around and see, wow, we're all sitting here, like in this dark cave, and what we thought was like the meaning of life over here, namely to like maximize our income, and that consumption is happiness and job titles are like our identity. Maybe there's more to it. So he turns around and he sees the fire, right? That's like looking straight at the paradigm of the situation of the world, and it's too bright, so he's blinded. But eventually, wants to turn back and go back to the wall and look there, right? But eventually he sort of makes his way out here. And he comes out and finally sort of discovers the real world out here, and that's even brighter. So it's for the people down here, it's extremely difficult mentally. I mean, it's obviously a mental to leave the cave because it gets brighter and brighter. I mean, you can also imagine that like with couples, typically what happens is that one person discovers these sort of like new ideas, and they all go like, wow, this is a great idea, here's a book, you should read it. And the other one reads it's like, no, I'm not ready for this. And so it becomes a struggle to like pull people out. And of course, once you've been out of it, right, you can see the alternative. So these guys are much happier. They can see birds and trees and stuff like that. These guys are still trying to figure out like, should we go up there, and how do we climb the final, like piece of the cave? Because everything in here is given. Like you spend literally like 25 years of your life going to college, the school system, and like being raised by parents so you literally have like a 20 to 25 year education. Whereas up here, you've maybe read like one book and whatever you can find out. So this is a very pioneering approach up here. So that's essentially Plato's cave in the way I've sort of used or misused it. So if that's so that's why I felt that was like useful to lead with that one. I mean, I always had a hard time writing introductions to books. I mean, I'm on my second book project, and I've been struggling for 5 years with this stupid introduction, and I just can't find it. But when I saw Plato's Cave for that one, it's like, yeah, this is it. We're going with that one. That's really everything. Yep.
It's also a very nice painting.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah. So I guess sort of moving on. I guess sort of the next talking point we had was you talk about in the book like sort of the role or like the current role of college, and you just sort of touched on it right then. I guess you're saying in college it's more for like talent discovery and good experience, and really all you're getting is sort of a new exposure. You mind sort of elaborating on that a little bit?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, if you look at at my old blog and particularly the book, I used to be a lot more against college education than I am today. A lot harsher because I was still in it. Had a PhD in theoretical physics, and my original career was supposed to go the full path and become a professor and teach people. But you'll see in there, especially after I came to the US, I began to look at the system over here, and why are people spending 50,000, 100,000 for something like, was it like, I forget the title of the movie, like, but why spend so much? But why spend so much for an education that you can get for free with a library card and 50 cents in penalties, right? So I kind of like realized the hypocrisy of criticizing, education in that form when I have it myself. But my point back then was that college degrees, it has become much more a question of the degree than the actual education. Whereas, like I referred to in the introduction, that the idea has become you just have to have a STEM degree, and then you just got to get your specialized so you can get a ticket, to sitting behind a computer and like making programs that nobody cares about for 30 years, right? So people are trying to buy their way in, and everybody goes to college. And the problem is, of course, if everybody has to go to college, right, people are not getting smarter. That's definitely my opinion. I mean, I originally wanted, when I did my first interview for grad school, they asked me like, so why do you want to be a professor? And then my answer was, well, it was my hope that once you come to like the university, you're actually interested as a student in what we're teaching. And they just laughed at me. So like 80% of the students in a class they don't really want to be there. They don't want to learn anything. They just want to, get a high GPA and graduate so they can go on and learn things. But I mean, I've come around on that a little bit. I think there's more to college than just, getting your degree or passing, like learning a bunch of stuff from textbooks. I mean, there's all the other stuff.
Wait, that was your experience in grad school or in undergrad? That
well, I mean, I've gone all the way through, right? I was still quite, I would say, naive in undergraduate, still very idealistic, in like super naive in the sense like we're all gonna get a Nobel Prize, and discover new exciting things and so on. And in grad school, I was beginning to lean more in the direction, what am I actually doing here, right? We're just doing. We're essentially publishing papers that are like supremely interesting to 5 other people in the world, but otherwise not really relevant for anything, right? So our main role at this university is to be TAs for a bunch of students. Sure. And dialing up the cynicism. Well, why are we grad students here? That's because we are substantially cheaper to hire than like industry level people with master's degree, even though we are creeping in.
I would agree with that. Most of my, anything I've published has not been really read by more than 5 or 10 people as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it might turn into someone's master's thesis, and of course, you can be lucky enough to figure something out that's really important. But for the most part, it's more about keeping the research culture of the university going, hoping that something might come out of it. I mean, that's I would say another thing that became apparent to me. It's is it Friedman or something? I don't want to blame anyone in particular, but where the idea is we have all this supremely valuable knowledge in libraries. And I'm absolutely sure, at least with regards to physics, is no, we don't. I mean, if all the scientists in the world just died, nobody could go into the library and recreate that knowledge, because half the knowledge sits in people's brain, right? And it's this whole master and apprentice culture going on, which is very different between grad school and undergraduate. Yeah. So I saw myself increasingly as part of that, process instead.
So you're kind of speaking to the idea that we're kind of trained to specialize in our lives and with the hopes that we will be better off, but you kind of counter that argument with it is better to be a generalist than a specialist, and you kind of introduced the idea of the Renaissance man.
Yeah. And I think so if going back to the whole college idea, where we should all become essentially what is a single cog in an industrial machine, right? Instead of being full humans. It used to be sort of in the Benjamin Franklin style, the American college, you're supposed to actually become this kind of Renaissance man, right? In that you had like a wide understanding of the world, and by going to college, your understanding of the world would even like increase, and you'd live in a richer world, and thus like move society forward. But what we've done, especially in I think the last 30 years, if not more, it's probably a process that's been going on for a long time. It's just the 30 years I've been in it or seen it, is that we've shrunk that core back down again. So we've given up a lot of basic adulting skills. For my generation, so I'm 45 now, we still learned how to cook and do basic woodworking, something like electronics and shop class. That was optional, but it was still there. But for the newer generation, all that stuff has been saved away. So now they just do like computing or something. So the core is essentially shrinking, but they're specializing even further. So essentially, in my opinion, we're turning into ants, almost like in an anthill. So it might be economically super efficient, right? We all become richer. But on the other hand, because we are losing all these skills, I mean, we can't even cook for ourselves. So if like the car needs an oil change, we don't know how to do that. If the bike gets a flat, wow, this is too complicated. So we need to hire a specialist to fix a flat on our tire, and we pay them $15, right? Whereas two generations ago, people could do all this themselves. So now we're paying like extremely high amounts for something we could do ourselves, actually. So it's efficient for the industrial part of the machine, but it's very inefficient on the consumer part, on the consumer side. So we have, $50,000 lifestyles, but they're actually not really, that's the price of them, but the actual value is much, much lower. We're not getting anything for our money, so to speak.
Yeah, and I guess with the FIRE movement, it seems a little more focused on just the financial aspect, whereas you're speaking more on if we have more skills, then we can lower our expenses, and then we don't need to make as much money.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it was originally. I mean, I would say that's the base of it. But then as it gets more popular, you bring it back to what the mainstream was, the traditional, well, you got to earn $1 million. How do you do that? Increase your income. How do you do that? Increase your skill set, get a higher salary. And the best way to do that is to not spend time on increasing a broad base of different capitals, right? And my lament there is, by not doing that, then you actually, and so even if you have like a lot of money, you end up living in a fairly, I would say, mentally it's the wrong word, but like a poor world, right? it's philosophically impoverished in the sense if all you know about joy and meaning is buying a bigger TV or sipping latte at a restaurant or paying for an airline ticket, like you know nothing but that, right? I mean, that's not impressive, right? It's not impressive to me anyway. I mean, my general example of that is so I actually worked for a Wall Street trading company for a couple of years, and that's almost exclusively about money. And sometimes we would get these rewards where we would get the box seats at fancy basketball or hockey games. And I'm not really a sports watcher, but I have played sports. And I would say playing something like hockey is much more fun than sitting and watching a bunch of professionals doing. I mean, you just cannot substitute, the feeling of doing a slap shot and scoring or top shelving a hockey puck for watching some other dude do it. That, I mean, it's a different level when seeing and doing it, right? So when in that regard, I would say adding more capital. I mean, you have typically, your financial capital. If you go to the personal finance movie, you have your financial capital, and then you have your job capital, but there's not so much focus on other things. But if you have more kinds of capital, and by capital I mean like skills and assets and tools and parts and things you can do within a given field, the richer your world essentially becomes. It's like a kitchen appliance. It's not just something you buy and then throw out. You can't. I mean, it's beyond those two. You can also like repair it. You can upgrade it. You can change it. You can build your own. And so in that world, in the original Ben Franklin sense, it kind of expands in that. And
you also touch on like social capital a lot, right, in this book.
Yeah,
like bartering and swapping things. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, because normally we just buy things, right? And then our houses fill up with this stuff because we don't even know how to sell it again. I mean, that's nuts, right? So we know how to buy things, and then we know how to throw them out. And depending on where you live, right? In Chicago, they have these trucks that drive up and down back alleys. And if you don't need anything more, you can just put it out in the alley and then it disappears. So it's like scrap dealers, but for like real goods. And you need like a city license to do it. I know in California in particular, we lived over there for a while. There's so much waste there. You can get almost everything for free. And so people get things for free and then they go and sell them on eBay. And they can make a living that way. Things you can, I mean, I used to get, I mean, I right after I retired, I got into fixing bicycles because that's sort of like a good first step for someone who's like completely mechanically incompetent, because bicycles is typically, like unscrew this bolt, and put that part on, replace that part. And I would often pick up bikes that were in need of TLC. And what that meant was that maybe they just had a flat tire. And the person figured, well, it's cheaper easier just to like order a new bike off of Amazon and have that shipped, and then just like give the other one away. It's like, okay, I'll take that one, right? That was just crazy to me. So there's like a lot of waste being generated by this consumer process.
And I guess you also touched on like bartering your like skills, like swapping skills with friends and neighbors instead of using a traditional like currency.
Right. Yeah. And especially if you're like partnered up or married with someone on the same page, you can like substitute different things, you can compensate for each other. I mean, like the painting here. So I can't paint anything. So there's that, right? So if you can have some kind of symbiosis with your spouse or partner in that sense, then you can increase the complexity substantially in what you can do. So like with the garden, we started outside. So a couple of years ago, we decided to become substantially more self-sufficient in food, at least for the summertime. So the goal this year is to grow 500 pounds of vegetables, and we are 285 now. So fingers crossed. But she does all the like planning and planting and so on, and I do all the I'm basically the backhoe, so I do the shovel work and all that, and trenching and all that stuff, and she does the green stuff. I do the brown stuff and she does the green stuff.
Yeah.
So,
What vegetables are you guys growing? Just sort of a just off-topic question.
It's we have a long list of them, so that's actually more of a her question. I just eat them, but the primary goal was to get as much poundage as possible. So it's mainly zucchini and tomatoes.
Okay.
That's where we get most, and cucumbers, we get most of the weight of those. We decided not to grow for calories. And I think we're gonna try that next year. So it's basically cash crops, so things that would be expensive in stores.
Okay.
So we'll probably, and last year it was about worth $1,000 worth of stuff we grew out there.
Okay.
And it's pretty cool. You can just go out and get like organic
Right,
stuff
yeah.
instead of having to drive for it or plan for it. We need some tomatoes, so let's go out and get them, right? But next year we're going for like potatoes and corn and turnips, and so we're gonna see if we can get to like 100,000 calories or 500,000 calories. I think if you can get to 1 million calories, you can feed one adult for a year. So that's the ultimate goal. That's a lot of food, by the way.
I was trying to think. That is a lot of food.
Yeah, it is. Humans are big animals, so yeah.
So I guess you want to just go over, I guess just sort of from. So you were obviously very specialized in just what sort of made you, I guess, for a better lack of words, sort of wake up to this kind of new style of life that you were trying to live.
Right. So in 2000, I was still on the consumer treadmill. Essentially, I was, taking my stipend. I've always been frugal or miserly or tightwad, if you can call it that. I was always very sure what I wanted to spend my money on, and that was typically always consumer grade electronics. I was very much a gadget freak, and so so it's not like I didn't want to spend anything, unfortunately, because then I would have invested it, but I didn't. So I remember in 95, I spent something which converted with like $500 in money back then on a 120 megabyte hard disk, just because that was cool. So that's insane. But I eventually found that I did not get much joy out of that. It would be like a dopamine rush, buying the stuff and then using it for few months and then putting it away in the attic and then researching the new things. So in terms of my finances, it always sort of went like this, save, spend, save, spend, and so on. So that was my consumer matrix, if you want. So no debt or anything. But then after moving to Switzerland, I got a T1 connection in my dorm room, so instant internet, which was a very big deal back then, because that meant you could pretty much be online constantly. So I was studying physics by day, and then I was spending the nights just surfing randomly on web pages. And then I came across this anti-consumer web page that covered the end cycle of consumerism. So garbage patches and where all this stuff was ending up, and the resource limits were about to run out of conventional oil at that point. And that kind of got me really concerned in a sense, because I had imagined this Star Trek future, and studying astrophysics, I wanted to be contribute a small part to the evolution of all that. But then I realized that maybe there's limits to all this growth. If without energy you can't really do anything. I mean, there's this Liebig's law of the minimum, right? As long as you have relatively cheap energy, you can substitute a lot between different resources. You can innovate things, but if you have very poor ore concentration, right? Let's put another way. I'm getting a little derailed here, but it used to be that you could walk into a stream and pick up big copper nuggets, right, or iron. Whereas today you need to like mine like tons and tons of ore and then run it through a complicated process just to get the same amount, right? And you can only do that because you have a ton of energy to do it, right? And so without that energy, you know, there's like, as long if we're running out of that, then the only solution is to become much more efficient with the energy we use and the resources we use. And so I did some back of the envelope calculations, you know, in terms of how much money can we spend at the current level and still do it in a sustainable way. And so I based it on the ecological footprint and the global population and the global GDP. And I found that in $2,000, you could spend about $6,000 per person per year without overshooting and eventually causing some kind of crash or collapse, or having, you know, things develop. So like very few people have most of the money and nobody, and most of everybody else had very little. And so I wanted to see if it was actually possible. So I started trying to implement these sort of like as a frugality challenge to myself. Can I live on you know, $6,000 a year? And can I, more importantly, can I live a good life, an interesting life on $6,000 a year? So that's essentially how I got started on it. So back then I knew nothing. There was very few resources on how to do this stuff. So it's all pulled from many different weird resources. I mean, if you look at the bibliography back in this one, it's all really idiosyncratic and crazy reference. I mean, the reading selection is weird, right? I mean, it's it's pulling from all these different places. And so yeah, okay, so the other, I don't know if that I don't think that completely answered it. So like I was on this physics track and planning on doing that, and then I started the blog simultaneously. And eventually it became clear to me that what I was doing on the blog was substantially more, how do you say, relevant to a lot more people than my astrophysics work. I mean, you'd work for like 6 months to publish a paper and get it in an astrophysical journal, and it would be read by maybe 50 people. Just sort of like briefly, 5 people would get really into it, and then maybe you hear back from one person, well, can I ask you some questions about that or some data? Yeah, sure, here you go. Whereas with the blog, you begin to get like emails, wow, you changed my life, you know, that kind of stuff. And so you're really beginning to have an impact on that. And then I attended an intro week at my second postdoc, where one of the guys turned out also to be an ex-physicist. And I asked him, so like, why didn't you continue physics? And he said like, well, I wanted to do things that were interesting to more than 5 people in the world. And I was just going like, FMO, right? that is exactly me. And so I eventually decided to go with becoming some kind of like lifestyle guru kind of thing instead. Yeah. And I mean, at that point I was already financially independent, so I had the option to do that. And it was just, I mean, since the choice was there, and since the choice was no longer depending on having a salary, you know, you got to weigh other things than money when money is no longer a constraint, right? Then your optionality goes way up. Whereas most people are kind of like locked down by, because you got to have a paycheck, because we have bills we committed to like 10, 20, 30 years ago, right? And so we're stuck with this mindset. We have got to go to work, right? And that was actually fairly common amongst our colleagues. We often get asked, well, are we paying you guys enough to make a living? And then there was some, you know, people had different opinions on that. And I was like, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to say anything, because I'm like saving 80 to 90% of what they were paying me. Wow. So, yeah.
Just most of our professors just always complain that they pay us too much. So,
yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, I mean, like, yeah. Well, I think with grad students, you kind of play the numbers, right? So you don't know what comes out.
Well, I guess before we get to more personal questions, one of my favorite parts of the book was where you distinguish a plan from a strategy. Yeah. I hope you could share that with us.
should I do that in the book? It's been actually about 11 years since I last read it. So I would say that the popular distinction is that a strategy is just a bigger kind of. So this might be entirely different than what I wrote in the book. So this is my current perspective on it. That the popular idea is that a strategy is just a bigger and a word for a bigger and fancier plan, right? It's just a huge plan. But I mean, to me, a strategy is more of a process where you develop a wider perspective on doing things. So it's more a set of principles and a step-by-step thing. Plans are typically context-free, whereas strategies, you have the context. So if something happens, that is not in the plan, a strategy can deal with it, but you're lost with a plan. So I don't know if is MapQuest still a thing? Because that was my favorite example.
I used to use it all the time.
Yeah, same.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so like with map, actually we do these kind of 10K walks now. We start and you usually get a map, right? And you get a set of walking instructions, like 50 steps, go to that street, turn left, go to that street, turn right, walk half a mile, do this and do that. And sometimes, because the map is not the territory and the territory is not the map, right? Sometimes the actual the plan, the list of instruction does not match the map itself. And the map, of course, requires a strategy, namely navigational skills, how to operate it. But the map quest itself requires nothing. It's context free. So when we get lost on the plan, we can turn to the strategy, so to speak. I mean, maybe another way of describing it is in the book I also have what I call the 6 C's. So that's in chapter 4, I think. So like copy, compare, compile. It's either calculate or compute. I think it's compute anyway, and then coordinate and create. And those 6 stages reflect different learning stages. And I subsequently found out that there's like many models for learning. So my favorite other model is Dreyfus. And there's also Ericsson. There's a bunch of them, and they all kind of match me, and that suggests that, well, this is pretty much how the human brain learns. So we all start by copying something. We see something, and then we say, okay, I'm going to do exactly like that, right? So you can do that if you have a set of instructions. You just go like, okay, I say 50%. I put them all in an index fund, and then the market always goes up, and then I become rich in 15 years, and then step 5, I can retire, right? So that's the copy stage, and you can get a plan like that in 15 minutes. It's very simple. You don't need to know anything. You don't need to think about it, and so like a lot of people prefer that. But once it goes wrong, it really goes wrong, because suddenly you're stuck in the proverbial, you gotten lost and you don't know how to get back. So the second stage is the compare stage, where you can essentially copy 2 things. You can keep 2 ideas in the head at the same time, and you can compare them. What I had actually thought about was maybe this gets way too complicated. If we go back to like cooking, so like nobody knows how to cook anymore, in my opinion. So that used to be like a basic adulting skill, but now we just like order out or take in and so on and so forth. So with at the copying level, you can essentially follow a recipe. So someone gives you a recipe, that's a set of instructions, that's a cooking plan. And so you look up the recipe, and then you look at the ingredients, and then you go out and buy them, right? And if you compare, you can look at 2 different recipes and understand, well, this one is better than the other one, and so I'll pick this one. So you can start ranking. You essentially develop, like bigger than or smaller than in your math, in your algebraic understanding of this. When you get to the compile stage, you've been doing this for a while, so you can make entire lists of recipes. So you can have, in personal finance, you're now at what I call the tips and tricks stage. or the listicle state, like here are like 10 books you should read to become smart, right? So now you have 10 books, not just one book is better than the other, or read this book. And so now you have lists of recipes, you can rank them, and you can more importantly begin to see, well, there's some things that go again, there are some commonalities in here, but you haven't quite identified them yet, but you're beginning to get an idea, right? At the compute state, and this is where the strategizing can begin. So it doesn't begin before that. You can make, instead of like running to the store every time you need like a new ingredient, you make a meal plan. Say Monday I eat this, and then Tuesday I eat that, and so on to Friday. And so we need all these ingredients. So we just need one big shopping trip, and then we have the entire weekend covered. And so we don't end up like I like to go into people's kitchens, like if I'm invited, of course, and then see what they have in their like pantries and refrigerators. And you can often tell if someone is operating on the plan level or the recipe level, is in that nothing they own in terms of surplus ingredients is edible, in the sense that nothing can be turned into a meal. It's all like dead ends, old powders of something and condiments and pickles, but there's no way to cook it together into something edible. And that means there's like a substantial amount of waste in there, because you just have to plan, you don't see the environment as you're going down the street. You don't see the context. So there's no way to bring in those resources because you lack the skills to do it. And this is, again, like going back to earlier, why it's important to have a bigger perspective of what you're doing. So that gets you to like the fifth stage of the coordination stage. And that is where you can begin and look at what ingredients you have, and you can take recipes apart, and you can begin to see the ingredients for what they do. And if you have some leftovers from yesterday, maybe you can, like tweak the recipe a little bit and roll them in. And at that point, food waste decreases a lot. It's like the average American wastes something like 50% of all the food they buy. Just goes like out the garbage on the landfill, making methane and stuff like that. And of course the money is wasted, right? The average family spends something like $600 to $700 a month, right? So reaching the coordinate state, which is where strategizing begins, cuts the food bill. You eat the same thing, you just waste, you cut your waste by half. So now you're only spending $300 a month. And so that essentially means like 100,000 less you need to save in order to cover that with capital income. Right, so that we're talking years of work for learning this stuff, right? And then finally, at the create state, you get to the point where you can go in and look at a functional pantry and then whip up, well, there's some onions there and some spaghetti, and so I can do that something with those tomatoes over there and make something, and there's some hamburger over there, so we can put that together and turn it into something. I mean, you see exactly the same stage for anything, whether you're learning physics or writing. You start by copying, and then eventually you compute closed-end problems, and where you read a chapter, right, and there's a textbook problem, the answer somewhere in the chapter you just read. And when you get to grad school, for example, then you have to begin to coordinate between different books, because you can't just rely on the answer being in this particular book. You have to draw on previous knowledge, and in order to go on as a researcher, you have to begin to become creative, right? So the creative force you have to build up all the base level knowledge. So it's more like a giant pyramid, essentially, where you build each step. It's not like you can magic your way up to the creative stage without mastering the fundamentals. And in that regard, strategizing about something requires that you reach compute or higher. So I'd say strategizing is maybe coordinating and creating, whether it's like troop movements or anything, right? So I don't know if that matches what I said in the book, but something along those lines.
I think you also talked about that once, sort of like, I think you equate being at the create stage to being like an expert. Right? Yeah. I think you sort of touched on that once you've gone to the create stage in like one field, it becomes much easier to become an expert sort of in other fields.
Yeah, I think so, because it's like Charlie Munger's of Berkshire Hathaway and Invesco, right? So he has this lattice work idea. And it's also been my experience from having developed some mastery in several different fields, in that a lot of human ideas go again and again and again and again. It's just they're all independently invented, so to speak. And so humans use different words. And so it might actually take you a while to figure out what the words are in this separate field, right? But once you do, you already understand the thinking that goes into it. And so you can very quickly pick it up if it's close to it. I mean, if you're good at math, it's a lot easier to say you're a math professor. You can do fairly well in physics, even though you never had any physics. You can do much better than, say, a professor of French coming in. But also vice versa. If you already speak 5 languages, it's not that difficult to learn language number 6 if it's in the same language family. So in that regard, there's a multiplier effect. And so with the hours, so that's I don't remember if I matched them completely. Like the copy state is like it takes like an hour or 2, and then the create state, you need to go up to your standard 10,000 hours.
Yeah.
Or something of that order. But that's only the first time. The second time, the required amount of work drops drastically. Like computer languages, right? If you're a good programmer, you're expected to, like spend the weekend to pick up something, right? So a new language.
That's cool. Well, I think we're going to shift gears a little bit and ask you some more just questions about your life, because you're a very intentional person, it seems. So I guess if you could explain how you chose to live where you live, and where do you live right now?
We live right. I mean, yeah. This one was actually chosen. This location was chosen more or less intentionally. Previously, no, though. So I'm only deliberate on the medium term, as in like I like to say I have like a 3 to 5 year planning horizon. But I've never had this like 30-year career plan. This is how my life is gonna go until the end. That seems to be somewhat more normal for people who end up, like in one track thing, doing the same thing for 30 years. So a lot initially, it was very much driven by the limits, the career limits I had. So if you did what I did, which was researching arcane details on the top of neutron stars, there's only like 3 or 4 or 5 places in the world where they do that. So in that sense, the choices was essentially made for me. Like, you can pick between these 2 places. Okay, I'll pick this one. Okay, so I'm there for a couple of years, right? And that's a common problem in very specialized research. And if you get married or in any way hooked up, it's known as a 2-body problem, right? I guess you've heard about it, yeah. So where one spouse, one has to move, but then the other one is typically also highly educated, but there's nothing for them to do, right? And so they end up as a lab assistant or something, right? And so it destroys essentially one career. We managed to make it work now. So especially after I retired, it became a lot easier. My wife also has a PhD, but she also does something different now. We picked the Great Lakes region. I mean, I got a job offer here to go into like quant work, which was something I mean, growing as a physicist, we had, I don't know if that's still the case or whether that was just sort of my era or generation. We had sort of like a hands off. We've kind of felt very snobby towards money and all that. So like business is something you do if you're not good at math. That was kind of like the attitude. And I kind of like regret that now, because I mean, now I think it's a lot more interesting than doing, quantum field theory, because it's a softer science. So it's a lot more complex in that sense. Less complicated, but more complex. So I always wanted to be a quant, and I tried to become a quant back in 2008. And then everything crashed, right? They laid off like tens of thousands of people. And I say, okay, forget about it. But then as it recovered again, then I made some commentary about if only they had more physicists working on Wall Street, then this wouldn't have something like a very arrogant comment, right? But one of my blog readers picked up on that and said something like, if you're still interested in that, maybe I can make that happen, right? And I was like, yeah, sure, yeah, let's go for it, right? And so I asked my wife, and she was kind of getting tired of her job. She was basically doing remediation on gas stations, like, because back in the old days, they built them single walled, figuring that, well, they'll never rust, right? But eventually they did rust. And so all that gasoline started flowing out into the groundwater, and she was operating these pumping trucks, like sitting there and cycling them around. That was not enjoyable. So whether she was okay with like moving to Chicago, because yeah, sure she was. Then she changed track and became an accountant, and a tax accountant for a few years. So she's also kind of flexible. So we're the same in that regard. So it's very much about, I would say, serendipity and optionality. So like it's to me more about living an interesting life, and not being bored in that sense. And to do that, you need the flexibility to do so, and a wide range of skills.
How did you meet your wife, and what was it hard to get her to see your way of living, or was it? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I have a better understanding of what happened now, how the process went. So I met her online back when that was a strange thing to do. Now everybody does it, right? I was sort of like ahead of the times in many places, and in many cases. And it turned out that she was actually working in the building right next to me. So she was a grad student, and I was a postdoc. And so we emailed back and forth. Yeah, I'm there. Oh, I'm there. Like, okay, let's meet. I was like, wow, in 5 minutes. Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, we're ready for this. And then sort of like had a very, I wouldn't say similar temperaments in that sense, but we're very good at arguing as adults in that sense. So in terms of conflicts and being I was certainly ahead of her in terms of this, personal economics, frugality kind of research, resource focused lifestyle, whereas she was still more normal, as in, we need something, let's go down to Walmart and pick it up. So, standard thinking process. Like, no, we can't do that. We got to think about this first. And so she's probably now a little bit ahead of where I was then, and I'm again substantially more ahead of where I was when I wrote the book. I'm concerned with other things in ERE now, sort of like a little bit more spiritual or whatever, sort of like more of a global scale. And she's so we've sort of tracked each other up in terms of that, and it's the higher we both go, I mean, the better we can develop a more, how do you say, complex organization in that sense, like with the painting or the gardening, So the more it's instead of having one person and doing some kind of system inside that person, combining the skills and being doing the renaissance of the systems thinking. Now we have two people with more skills, and we can do the systems for both of us together, which then creates like a substantially richer world. And I suppose if you go back to the actual Renaissance with larger families, this would be even more impressive. But I mean, what we have now is essentially the nuclear family. We don't have clans or tribes, so it's kind of limited to two people. So you still need two people who are focused on that process. Whereas several generations ago, you did not need all this fancy and highfalutin systems thinking, thinking in terms of capitals and personal development and assets and tools and parts. It just came naturally. It was just there, and nobody thought about it. It just worked because it had essentially evolved to work. So yeah, got derailed a little bit again.
So I guess when we scheduled this originally, it was scheduled for a Sunday night, and then you asked to move it because you were going primitive camping.
Yeah.
Is that explain what that is? And
yeah, that was unfortunately a little bit of a failure on my part, because when we came down there, I chickened out on account of mosquitoes and humidity. So we went to Motel 6 instead. But the point is, I mean, we've started doing these 10K and higher K walks for medals, and so we had a dog for almost since we got married, actually before we got married, for 15 years, and he died a year ago, and it was a pug, and so he couldn't fly, and he was very attached, separation anxiety and all that, so we couldn't do anything without the dog. And so now we're trying to catch up and do all the things that we wanted to do to do that. And part of that was vacationing in different places, being active and going, doing things on weekends instead of going to the dog park. So that was essentially part of that. So yeah.
Cool. And what other types of projects are you working on right now?
Yeah, that's a terrible question to ask me. I don't know. Asking a retired person what their job title is, because there's always like several different things going on. So like my main aim is not to be bored, because that's a frequent problem when people come in and retire. If they don't have, the whole world is arranged so that you're occupied from 9 to 5, if not more, 5 days a week, and then there are like weekends where people can do something, or if you have like sports activity, you can do that for like a couple of hours a week. But if you want to do things with others, it's very limited in that sense, because everybody else is busy in that sense. So that's what I meant in terms of like a richer world or a poorer world. So you have to be very self-motivated in terms of coming up with your own projects, because there's no infrastructure for non-working people in that sense, non-salary people. So I mean, right now, I guess we are doing like a lot of house maintenance and repainting the windows. How interesting that is that we need to fix the garage roof, and I've started building clocks out of wood.
Started building what?
Huh?
What, you started building what?
Clocks, like grandfather clocks, like TikTok.
Oh,
yeah,
very cool.
Yeah, I mean, when I finished the first one, I was definitely putting it up there with somewhere between finishing the PhD and finishing the master's thesis, because it's built like entirely from scratch.
Wow.
And it kept time. It was made out of wood, and when I first tuned it, I could get it within 30 seconds a day. So that's if you're into watch timekeeping, 30 seconds for 24 hours, that's actually pretty insert explicative good.
Well, especially for your first time, right?
It was a simple clock though, so clock number 2 didn't go so well. So that was because there's like a lot of friction. It's mechanical clocks, obviously. I mean, it's not just where you build some kind of fancy, case, and then you put a quartz clock in there. No, you really build all of them. I have some parts over here, so this is like an escapement wheel.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
And if you put the pendulum on this one, if I put this right, then it goes, this is like mirror. So this goes up. Oh, sorry, other way. So here it stops here, tick, tock. It's kind of hard to do this freehand. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This is all hand cut.
Wow.
Yeah, so it requires a lot of concentration. And so people went and asked me like, wow, this is so cool, Jacob. Why don't you sell them? And then the answer is that there's a reason that can't buy, they don't make clocks out of wood, and that is humidity. Because as soon as humidity changes, and the friction might change a little bit, and so you'll constantly be adjusting them. So it's like some of the early clocks were actually made out of wood, dates back to the 13th century. But I mean, the clock technology, so to speak, the simplest escapement, but it never became a practical thing for timekeeping, for making people show up on time or ringing the church bells, to regulate where people were going, until actual like metal machining developed to a significant, to a point where you could make them out of metal. So that's something I want to do eventually. But I mean, it took me, I would say, 5 years to establish, sort of slowly build up the woodworking skills to where I feel like reasonably competent to, if someone gives me something, like I'd say half the furniture in the house I built,
Wow.
and the other half we got for free from various places. But right now clocks became, like, it's more fun to build a clock that runs and keeps time than it is to build a commode. so that's when plus I figured out, like, why do I spend like 30 hours building, a bench or something when I can pick something up for free somewhere and build a clock instead.
There you go.
So hence the clock building. And then, I mean, other project outside is the garden. We pretty much dug up the entire backyard. So the lots around here are 25 by 125. So 25 feet wide and then 120. So it's about,
Okay.
I'd say it's about 20 by 40 feet, the yard out there. Just vegetables up to about, I'd say, waist height for me.
Okay.
Wow.
Like tomatoes, like it's complete wilderness out there. But so that's the other thing we do a lot of right now. And then I think this year I've started doing some more podcasting interviews and presentations. So I'm preparing, actually I have like several in the pipeline now. So I do one at a time because of limited brain space, but I'm doing a sort of like a slideshow on the Stoa in a couple of weeks. So like the second time, I don't know if you saw the first one where I do the whole ERE show. So now it'll be about ERE in a larger context, like emergent movements and how we can use this to change the world, So I like to, you need something meaningful, you need something practical, you need something fun, essentially. You need to try to cover all components. Otherwise it can get kind of dreary. So
this is sort of an off-topic question, but did you ever get into like natural building and like looking at, I don't know if you're familiar with like cob houses or cordwood houses?
To a degree, I think I'm a little bit afraid of anything I can't lift and throw though.
Okay.
So like I don't like motorcycles or cars because they're too heavy, and definitely not houses. But yeah, I mean,
Okay.
back in the day, I was definitely looking. I wanted to build like an Earth ship.
Okay.
When tiny houses came out, yeah, we should do like a tiny house thing. I've been interesting. I want to build a boat, so maybe someday I'll return to those and like finally get up the guts to do it. Because in principle, it shouldn't be difficult.
No, yeah, it
like,
really.
Lift it, so it scares me, right? So it's some weird limitation I have. So and again, it's I would say with the tiny houses. Not to dunk too much on those, but economically, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to go that way. That was also my dad's point. So like, don't do that because you have to sell it sometime, and someone has to buy it. So it's better to buy a normal house and even sell it at a loss, because on the tiny house you're gonna lose almost everything. So I don't know if that's the case anymore, but you don't want to like spend. That's the point. I mean, the point is you don't want to like make something that's too weird, that's too far away from the regular economy. So
yeah,
that's
true.
I would say the other thing where ERE is maybe a little different than, so it's like not full on prepping where you say like self-reliance, where you just say I'm gonna go homesteading, off grid and all that, or the farming sort of stuff where like I hate money, I'm not gonna have anything to do with money, I'm just gonna grow vegetables. To me, that's too hard. It's not Pareto efficient in a sense. You wanna go to a place where you get 80% of the returns for 20% of the effort. You don't want to pay the final 80% to just be like completely consistent, right? So it's the same with houses. I mean, live in a regular house, it's not like sexy or special or anything, but it's resource efficient in that sense, and it's flexible in the sense that we can sell it and move away from it. It's also, since we're not renting, so that's from the other side, right? We can make modifications to it, like making the backyard. So it's all about like increasing the adaptability and the optionality. So decisions are made kind of with that in mind.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. So what, I guess, you sort of touched on it earlier, that you had a very interesting bibliography in the book. I guess I would like to say, I think as I was paging through it, I think we had 3 or 4 books that we had previously covered on our podcast. But I guess what other books are you reading right now, or I guess can you give us a sneak peek? You talked about you're writing another book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really super sure. It's very useful to say what I'm reading in particular. I find like with books, it's often the case that I think of a book as more of like a conversation, if that makes sense. So if you're like ready for the book, you'll get a lot more out of it than if you're not. Does that make sense?
So sure, yeah.
So it very much depends on what you bring in. So one of the things I'm reading more these days is integral psychology stuff. This is something that was actually presented to me 20 years ago. And back then I just thought it was like a bunch of hippie talk. And now I think, okay, now this makes more sense to me. It was the same thing with like Sun Tzu, The Art of War. I kept hearing back then, like, well, this is an awesome book. You should read this. This explains everything. And so I started reading it when I was like 15. I read it multiple times, but it didn't really click for me until I started trading. It's like, oh, that's what they mean, you know, about like commanding the environment and all that, you know, different, you know, locations and stagings and so on. So in that regard, if I had to make like specific book recommendations, it would maybe be to return to something that one has previously rejected and then try again. I'll say probably in 10 years, I will make another attempt at trying to appreciate poetry, because that stuff just doesn't sit well with me. I think it was completely like, I mean, my appreciation was completely killed in high school. And so, you know, like analyze this and what is the author trying to convey with this like weird prose? It's like, I'm still not getting it. Whenever I see a poem anywhere, I just skip. But maybe I'll get back to that. Otherwise, I mean, if like what I'm reading now, I'm reading the latest annual assessment report, not the ERE6 from the climate change report, the physical science basis. But that's not really interesting to other people to read as much, right? So,
I guess before we wrap up, one question a bunch of my friends started telling me to ask you once they found out you were going to be on is, what do you do for healthcare? What do you tell people that are trying to manage healthcare when they, you know, retire early?
Not easy to answer. I mean, we're lucky enough that my wife still has a full-time job, so she can work from home. So we get it from that. So as it has mostly happened, we've taken turns on our special project, so to speak. So once she gets tired of this, maybe I'll get a job or something. But I mean, that's not the entire solution. We've been on the private plans as well. I was on a private plan. I think especially in the US, you really have to, you know, understand the rules for the particular state and even the particular county you're living in, like tax repercussions and all that stuff. So it's a really big deal. But since it's not even something where you can get general advice for it. Because if you live in, I mean, we're in Cook County, Illinois. So because that's a giant county and it's in the blue state, you know, we have it pretty good in terms of the private market. But if, I don't know, there are other states and counties where the prices are through the roof for the same thing because there's no competition, because it's essentially regulations are so bad or so non-existent that you can't do it. So I would say the most generic advice would be, once you retire and have to pick a place to live, then healthcare costs should definitely enter into it. That would be my solution to it. Simply move. It's probably not an answer most people would appreciate. I don't know. I mean, but it's kind of sad that it has to be this way. So maybe it'll be fixed. I don't know. I mean, it's a complex problem. I mean, because of the whole. I mean, there's so many interests, you know, deciding all this, and it's very hard to get them all to agree at the same time and thus change the system. So. Yep.
Yeah, well, we're actually having Marshall Allen on, who wrote a book about battling the healthcare system in a couple weeks. So that should be a good discussion.
Yeah.
So you got any more questions?
I think I'm probably good.
Jacob, you want to tell people like where they can learn more about ERE, or if they can reach out to you, or
I mean, I would say it's like a three. I've sort of parted it into three, where the blog itself, I haven't updated the blog in many years. I mean, I basically stopped writing on it in 2011. So since then, there's only been a few updates. So it's just an auto cycle. And the blog itself is, I would think of as my research notes for writing the book. So like throwing out ideas, getting feedback, see what works, and like I was writing the two things simultaneously. So I like to think that I like kept all the good stuff for the book. So if say hearing me like rant and all that sounds interesting, then maybe check out the blog. And if that sounds interesting, you're really gonna like the book. But and then the third part is that there's a sort of like a semi-active forum of like-minded people as well. So that goes back to about 2010, 11-ish as well. And so since about that time, I've written a lot there as well, but it's all buried in various threads and so on. So on sort of unraveling that. So there's a lot of stuff that has been written down. And so these three things, so blog is easy, book is, all together, and forum is very long and very deep in that sense. And there's also wiki specifically, but we haven't done that much with that. But there's some overall summaries. Yeah. So that's what I have. And then there's like, if you go to the that we like the left sidebar of my blog, I have listed my previous podcasts and so on. And so if you don't want to read the book, I would go to like the Stoa presentation, where I do a slideshow for about 40 minutes explaining ERE. You're not going to get, I mean, the book, as you probably noticed, is extremely information dense. So it's very hard to cover that in a sort of like, if you can briefly cover it. No, I cannot. So the Stoa is probably your best bet for a better overview of that. So yeah, I guess that's it. What I have.
Well, thanks a lot for coming on. And with that, please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations, or if you would like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to this would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. And Al, what book are we reading and discussing in 2 weeks?
We are doing The Black Swan by Nicholas Taleb. It should be a good one.
Awesome.
Yeah, I recommend dynamic hedging.
Oh. Yeah, we were talking about that beforehand. Yeah. I'll have to jot that one down. Dynamic hedging.
Okay. All right. Take care.
Thank you, Jacob. It was wonderful having you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Really love the book.
Okay.